Track 1, questions 1 to 12. You hear a dermatologist talking to a patient called James Carter who suffers from eczema and is attending for a treatment review. For questions 1 to 12, complete the notes with a word or short phrase that you hear. You now have 30 seconds to look at the notes. Now, Mr. Carter, I understand your GP has referred you to me so that we can review the treatments you're using for your eczema.
That's right.
So, tell me a bit about this eczema. When did it start?
Well, my first major flare-up was last year. My family and I had just returned from a relaxing beach holiday where we spent a lot of time enjoying the sun, swimming, and eating out at restaurants. We had a wonderful time, but it wasn't long after we got back home that I started feeling a sharp, intense pain in my foot. At first, I thought it was just the result of too much walking on the beach or maybe even an old injury flaring up. But soon the pain became unbearable and my foot started swelling up. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. And I woke up one morning feeling unusually uncomfortable only to find red, itchy patches all over my arms and chest. The sensation was both alarming and frustrating because I had no idea what could have caused it. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I initially thought it might be a reaction to the sun, since I had spent quite a bit of time outdoors during the previous days, or maybe some kind of rash from the seawater, which can sometimes irritate the skin. The patches seemed to spread a bit, and the itching was getting worse, so I started to worry that it could be something more serious.
Oh, I see.
The itching got really bad, though much worse than I had initially expected. It wasn't just localized to my arms anymore, it started spreading rapidly to my neck and chest, making me feel extremely uncomfortable. The sensation was almost unbearable, and the more I scratched, the worse it seemed to get. That's when I started to worry that it might be something more serious like an allergic reaction or a skin condition. I could no longer ignore it. My wife, who had been watching me suffer, suggested it might be related to the new detergent we had started using for our clothes. She mentioned that I'd been using it for the past week, and perhaps it was the chemicals in the detergent irritating my skin. It made sense, and I started to consider that maybe I was allergic to it, but I wasn't entirely sure.
That's a possibility, but there are many potential triggers for eczema. Did you notice anything else unusual at the time?
Not really, but I did have quite a bit of stress at work around that time, which was likely contributing to my condition. I remember feeling overwhelmed with deadlines and long hours, and I'd often find myself working late into the evening. I've heard that stress can have a significant impact on skin conditions, and I think it definitely played a role in making things worse. Along with the stress, I also noticed that my flare-ups became much more frequent and severe during the winter months. The cold, dry air seemed to aggravate my skin even more, making it feel tight and itchy. I'd never had problems like this before, but suddenly I was dealing with a constant battle against irritation and discomfort, especially when the weather got colder.
Yes, stress can definitely be a trigger. So how did you manage the symptoms initially?
At first, I just used a regular moisturizer, thinking it would be enough to soothe the dryness and irritation. But unfortunately, it didn't really make much of a difference. My skin still felt tight and itchy, and the redness didn't go away. Frustrated, I decided to make an appointment with my GP to get a professional opinion. When I saw her, she suggested that I try using a topical steroid cream to help reduce the inflammation and calm my skin down. I started applying it, and within a few days I noticed a significant improvement. The redness faded, and the itching was much less intense. However, the relief was only temporary. As soon as I stopped using the cream, the symptoms came back with a vengeance. The itching and redness were even worse than before, and it felt like my skin was reacting even more strongly to the absence of the medication. It was really disheartening, and I started to worry about how to manage the condition long term.
That's not uncommon with steroid creams. Did your GP suggest anything else?
Yes, my GP prescribed an antihistamine tablet to help alleviate the itching. She explained that it would help reduce the histamine response in my body, which was causing the irritation. Initially, it seemed to work to some extent. The itching subsided a little, and my skin felt less agitated. However, I soon started to notice some unwanted side effects. The biggest issue was that it made me feel extremely drowsy and lethargic. I was constantly tired and found it really difficult to stay focused, especially at work. Simple tasks seemed to take longer, and I was struggling to keep my eyes open during meetings. I even started to feel a bit groggy and unfocused while driving. After a few days, I realized that the side effects were becoming too much to handle, so I decided to stop taking the antihistamine. It wasn't worth it if it was affecting my ability to function throughout the day.
Right? Did you try any other treatments or remedies?
I started using an over-the-counter hydrocortisone cream, hoping it would provide some relief from the inflammation and itching. It did help a little at first. The redness seemed to fade slightly, and the itching wasn't as intense. But after a while, I realized that I didn't want to rely on the cream too much, especially since it was a steroid-based product. I was concerned about using it too frequently and potentially damaging my skin in the long run. In addition to the cream, I tried to be more mindful of things that might trigger the flare-ups. I switched to wearing cotton clothes, thinking they'd be gentler on my skin and less likely to cause irritation. I also began using hypoallergenic soap, avoiding any products with fragrances or harsh chemicals that might make my condition worse. Despite these efforts, however, I didn't notice a huge difference. The flare-ups continued to come back, and I still felt like I was constantly battling the irritation.
Okay, and is there anything else you've noticed that might be relevant?
Yes, during the winter months, the eczema definitely gets much worse. It's like the colder temperatures and dry air have a real impact on my skin. The lack of humidity in the air causes my skin to dry out faster, making it even more sensitive and prone to irritation. I notice that my eczema becomes more inflamed, with the redness and itching intensifying. It almost feels like the cold weather just sucks the moisture right out of my skin, and no matter how much I moisturize, it never seems to be enough. The skin feels tight and uncomfortable, and sometimes it even cracks and bleeds from the dryness. Winter always seems to bring a wave of flare-ups, making it really hard to get any relief, and I dread the thought of dealing with this for months at a time.
That's quite typical with eczema. This condition often presents with flare-ups and symptoms such as dryness, redness, itching, and irritation. It's important to address both the immediate symptoms and the underlying factors to prevent recurrence. Let's take a closer look at your skin to assess the severity of your condition and any specific triggers or contributing factors. After that, we can discuss a more suitable long-term management plan tailored to your needs. This plan may include moisturizers, topical treatments, lifestyle adjustments, and strategies to avoid triggers, ensuring better control and improved quality of life.
Thank you. I'd really appreciate that.
No problem. Let's see what we can do. Extract 2, questions 13 to 24. You hear a doctor talking to a patient called Maria Thompson, a patient managing asthma. For questions 13 to 24, complete the notes with a word or short phrase that you hear. You now have 30 seconds to look at the notes.
Good morning, Ms. Thompson. I hope you're doing well today. From what I've gathered, you've been managing asthma for a while now, and I'd like to understand more about your experience with the condition. Could you start by telling me about your first significant asthma episode? For example, when did it happen, what symptoms you experienced, and if there were any specific triggers or circumstances you think might have contributed to it. This will help me get a clearer picture of your condition and how it has progressed over time, so we can work together to develop the best approach to managing it.
Yes, it happened about 2 years ago during a time when my family and I had just returned from a camping trip. The trip itself was lovely. We were surrounded by nature with plenty of trees, blooming flowers, and fresh air. It was such a refreshing and enjoyable experience. However, shortly after we got back home, I started noticing an unusual tightness in my chest. Initially, I didn't think much of it and assumed it was simply due to exhaustion from the trip. We had been fairly active, hiking and spending a lot of time outdoors, so I thought my body was just reacting to being a little overworked. But as the tightness persisted, I began to realize it might be something more concerning.
And when did the symptoms start to worsen?
My shortness of breath became much more noticeable when I was climbing the stairs at work. I would find myself getting out of breath much quicker than usual, which was strange because it was something I had always been able to do easily without any trouble. It started happening consistently, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The symptoms weren't just limited to climbing stairs, though. I also noticed that during exercise, like for example, when I went jogging, I would start gasping for air almost immediately. The shortness of breath would hit me so suddenly and intensely that I had to stop and catch my breath, which was very unlike me. It was really alarming and frustrating because it felt like my body wasn't cooperating and I didn't know what was causing it. That's when I realized that this wasn't just normal fatigue, it was something more serious that needed attention.
Did you consider what might have triggered it?
I initially thought the symptoms might be due to the pollen from the camping trip. There were so many flowers blooming during that time, and I've always had a bit of sensitivity to seasonal changes, especially during spring. So the air was thick with pollen, and I remember sneezing a few times during the trip, but I didn't think much of it back then. So when the tightness in my chest and shortness of breath started, it made me wonder if the exposure to all that pollen had triggered something more severe. However, I also considered that it might be related to the air freshener we had recently started using at home. So the scent was quite strong. It was one of those plug-in types that release a continuous fragrance. It filled the entire house, and while it smelled nice, I couldn't help but think it might be irritating my lungs or causing some kind of reaction. So the timing seemed to align, so I began to suspect it as another possible trigger. So both the pollen and the air freshener felt like plausible explanations, but I wasn't entirely sure which one was the main cause or if it was a combination of the two.
That's a possibility. Did you notice anything else unusual?
Yes, I was going through a particularly stressful time at work back then. The deadlines were piling up and I felt constantly under pressure. I've read that stress can make asthma worse, so I suspect it played a role.
That's quite common. How have you been managing the symptoms?
My GP prescribed me a blue reliever inhaler to help with the symptoms, and it worked really well for immediate relief. Whenever I started feeling breathless or tightness in my chest, using the inhaler would quickly ease the symptoms, which was a huge relief. However, my GP explained that while the reliever inhaler was effective for short-term control, it wasn't enough to manage my asthma in the long run. To address this, I was started on a steroid inhaler for long-term control. At first, it was a bit challenging to adjust to it. I noticed some throat irritation when I began using it. It made my throat feel a bit scratchy, and there was some mild discomfort. It was frustrating initially, but over time, I learned to use it properly, including rinsing my mouth after each use, which helped reduce the irritation significantly. Now, the steroid inhaler has become an important part of my routine, and the throat irritation has mostly subsided. I've noticed that my asthma feels more stable with its use, and I'm experiencing fewer flare-ups overall.
Have you tried any non-medical approaches?
Yes, I've incorporated breathing exercises into my routine, and they've been somewhat helpful. They've given me a better sense of control over my breathing, especially during moments when I feel my asthma starting to act up. These exercises help me stay calm and regulate my breath, which has been beneficial. However, I wouldn't say they're a complete solution. While they provide some relief, they don't entirely prevent the symptoms from occurring or address the underlying triggers of my asthma. In addition to the breathing exercises, I've been making an effort to avoid common triggers that I know can worsen my symptoms. For instance, I try to minimize exposure to pets, as their dander can be a trigger for me, and also taken steps to reduce dust in my living environment by cleaning more frequently and using hypoallergenic covers for bedding. These changes have made a noticeable difference. Although my symptoms haven't completely disappeared, I've experienced some improvement and the flare-ups aren't as frequent as before. It's an ongoing process, but I feel like these adjustments are helping me manage my asthma better.
That's a really good approach, and it's great to hear you're taking proactive steps to manage your asthma. To make your inhaler use even more effective and reduce the throat irritation you mentioned, I'd recommend using a spacer. A spacer is a simple attachment for your inhaler that helps deliver the medication more efficiently to your lungs. By using it, you can ensure that less of the medication settles in your mouth and throat, which should help minimize irritation. It's an easy adjustment that can make a big difference in both the effectiveness of your treatment and your overall comfort. In addition, I'd suggest keeping a symptom log. This involves tracking your asthma symptoms daily, noting when they occur, their severity, and any possible triggers you might have encountered. For instance, you could include details about activities, environmental factors like pollen or dust exposure, or even emotional states like stress. Over time, this log can help identify patterns or triggers that might not be immediately obvious. It's a useful tool for understanding what exacerbates your asthma and can also provide valuable information to your doctor for tailoring your treatment plan further. Combining these strategies can help you manage your asthma more effectively and improve your quality of life.
So that sounds like a great idea. Thank you.
Today, we're going to discuss how to respond effectively in cardiac emergencies to ensure the best outcomes for our patients. Unlike many general emergencies, cardiac crises often require rapid intervention to stabilize the patient's condition. For this reason, it's critical to be familiar with the layout and contents of the cardiac emergency cart, often called the crash cart. This cart contains everything you need to handle life-threatening situations, including tools for airway management, defibrillation, and medication administration. In today's session, we'll focus on understanding the organization of the crash cart and how to quickly locate and use the appropriate equipment during emergencies. Each drawer of the cart is organized to correspond to a specific type of intervention, so knowing its layout can save precious time during critical moments.
Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to discuss how effective communication can significantly improve patient outcomes. One of the biggest challenges we face as healthcare professionals is overcoming barriers to clear communication. These might include language differences, medical jargon, or even the stress and anxiety a patient might feel during a consultation. Throughout this lecture, we'll examine common obstacles to understanding and explore strategies to address them effectively. Whether it's through active listening, avoiding medical jargon, or using visual aids, breaking down these barriers is crucial to building trust and ensuring patients feel heard.
One of the essential skills you'll need as junior doctors is accurate and timely documentation of patient records. Remember, patient safety often depends on the information you provide in these records. Any delay in documenting critical data, such as medication changes, symptoms, or test results, can lead to errors in treatment. So, while technology like electronic health records has made this process easier, the focus remains on prompt, clear, and thorough recording. In today's session, we'll look at strategies to ensure your notes are accurate, comprehensive, and recorded in real time to avoid potential lapses in care.
In today's session, we'll be focusing on arrhythmias, specifically how to differentiate between the various types you might encounter in practice. It's critical to recognize whether an arrhythmia is life-threatening or benign, as this guides immediate and long-term management. We'll cover atrial fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia, and supraventricular tachycardia in detail. By the end of the session, you should be able to identify these arrhythmias on an ECG and understand the first steps for treatment in an emergency setting.
Before we proceed with today's surgery, I want to go over the patient's medical history and the detailed surgical plan. And the patient has a history of hypertension and diabetes, which could increase the risk of complications, so we'll need to monitor their vitals closely throughout the procedure. We'll also confirm the steps of the surgical plan to ensure everyone on the team is clear about their role. Let's start with an overview of the procedure, followed by a review of any specific concerns raised during the pre-surgical evaluation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to focus on finding the right balance between diet and physical activity when managing weight. It's not just about cutting calories, it's about ensuring your body gets the nutrients it needs while staying active. While exercise plays a crucial role in burning calories and boosting metabolism, The foods you eat determine how much energy you have for those activities. We'll discuss how to create a balanced meal plan that supports your weight goals and complements your exercise routine.
My name's Pietro Everall, and my presentation is about cholesterol. And it's a fascinating, if rather complex topic. And that probably accounts for why, amongst our patients, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of cholesterol and about when and why it represents a health issue. To my mind, this largely results from the rather loose use of the word, particularly by journalists and others, that leads to cholesterol being perceived as a bad thing in the patient's mind. As doctors and nurses, we have to find a way of telling our patients exactly what cholesterol is, in simple terms, and why it's important. And that means going back to the basic science. It's long been established that cholesterol, by helping to move fat around the body, taking it to organs that need it, is essential for health. That without it, the body wouldn't be able to function. But when it becomes oxidized or damaged, cholesterol can contribute to the buildup of plaque in the arteries, increasing the risk of heart disease and stroke. So, we often talk to patients about good and bad cholesterol as a way of avoiding more technical definitions, because there are different types of cholesterol particles. For example, low-density lipoproteins, often called LDL particles, are more likely to become oxidized and contribute to buildup of plaque, whereas larger, high-density or HDL particles are less likely to. So the labels good and bad, although simplistic, can help patients to see that we need to look at the whole picture rather than just focusing on the total amount of cholesterol in the body. And also that advanced lipid testing is important because it gives us information about the different types of cholesterol particles and helps us identify patients needing treatment. But patients can be reluctant to engage with the issue of cholesterol. As we know, when it comes to treatment, early intervention is key. But patients don't always see this. One thing they find hard to grasp is that although they feel perfectly fit and healthy, high cholesterol can be building up inside blood vessel walls, narrowing them and reducing blood flow to the heart and brain, thereby increasing the risk of cardiovascular problems. That's why it's imperative for those in high-risk groups, essentially men over 45 and women over 55, to have regular blood tests to measure not just the total amount of cholesterol in the blood, but also levels of HDL, LDL, and triglycerides, a fatty substance similar to bad cholesterol. And preventative medicine has a key role to play here. It is estimated that 60% of adults in high-risk age groups have raised cholesterol levels, and whilst genetic factors are sometimes in play, in most cases it's just the result of poor diet, obesity, and lack of exercise, often reflecting the habits of a lifetime. So it's clear that we should be talking to younger patients about these issues too, and not just about diet and exercise either. There's research to suggest a link between stressful situations and how the body metabolizes fat. And that's in addition to the fact that stressed out people are more likely to smoke or have poor diets. So, we should be underlining the need for a good work-life balance, for taking regular breaks and managing stress levels in the workplace, long before patients enter the high-risk demographic. Traditionally, statins have been the most commonly prescribed medication for high cholesterol, and that generally means a daily dose, taken orally for life. Statins lower LDL levels by slowing down the production of cholesterol in the liver. But a new drug called inclisiran works in a different way, targeting a gene that produces the protein PCSK9 to encourage the liver to absorb more bad cholesterol from the blood and break it down. As well as only requiring twice-yearly injections, making it much more convenient, the drug has fewer side effects, which, with statins, can include headaches and digestive problems, and studies show that treatment can reduce cholesterol by up to 50% in as little as 2 weeks. The drug's an example of what's called gene silencing. This is a unique mechanism that aims to disrupt the delivery of messages sent out by a gene that can cause illness. In the case of cholesterol, of the protein PCSK9. It doesn't touch the gene itself, an idea about which people do get nervous, and it bears no relation to things like gene editing, which also gets a bad press. The first such medication was a drug called Partizan. That was licensed in 2019 to treat amyloidosis, and work is continuing on similar drugs that could treat things like Huntington's disease and preeclampsia. So, in rolling out these injections to control cholesterol, we should be looking at the future of how all disease will be treated.
Today I'm talking to Leanne Haydock, a nurse with a special interest in the care of obese or plus-size patients. This is a real issue, isn't it, Leanne?
It is. The number of people carrying extra weight's been on the increase for some time. Obesity now affects around 1 in 4 adults in many Western countries, and it's known to be associated with increased risk of health conditions including type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. But we shouldn't forget that the reasons for this increase are complex and often very challenging to understand. So addressing the root causes of the issue isn't the job of health professionals on the front line. Our job is to offer optimal care for these patients. And this means moving away from treating them as the exception to the rule, towards making them an integral part of what we do. I'm committed to that idea, but making it happen is easier said than done. It means a major shift in both attitudes and policies.
So what sort of attitudes towards plus-size patients have you come across?
One issue they face is the very common misconception that they're somehow responsible for their size, that it's simply a lifestyle choice. Even amongst health professionals, you'll get comments like, if they just lose weight, there wouldn't be an issue. This is so unfair because the reasons for obesity are enormously varied and complex, and I find comments like this very disheartening. I can understand that it's human nature to judge other people, to wonder why someone's become so overweight, to feel that it was somehow avoidable, but none of that justifies offering this patient group anything but the best possible standards of care, and that's what we should be aiming for.
But treating them must involve adopting a different approach sometimes.
Yes, but we need to focus on finding the best flexible approach that works for all patients. Get away from the idea that the plus-size patient is unsuitable for the setup we have in place. For example, it's the bed that's not suitable, not the patient who's too big to fit the bed. The notion of an average-size patient lying on a bed that isn't large enough, or being expected to use a commode that's too small for them, would be rightly regarded as inappropriate and undignified care. Ensuring that plus-size patients have appropriate equipment and that everyone knows how to use it is crucial.
And specialised equipment is available?
It's not that the equipment doesn't exist. There are specialist versions of most things, from hoists to mobility aids to commodes. The problem is getting hold of these things in many hospitals. That's partly because traditionally it hasn't been a priority for funding, and policies haven't kept pace with changes in society. But there are other issues here too. What really causes headaches is where you can order, say, a large bed, but the doors, corridors and stairs aren't wide enough to get it to you. Many older hospitals weren't designed with the needs of plus-size people in mind. So even if you get the large bed in place, is there enough space for patients and staff to move around easily, and so on?
But clinicians have other concerns, especially around safety issues, don't they?
Well, yes. For nurses in particular, one major concern involves moving and manual handling. If a patient's carrying a lot of excess weight, then more staff may be needed, and there's a greater risk of somebody getting hurt. Turning a patient in bed, transferring to a chair, supporting a limb, all become much more complex and sometimes daunting if the patient is plus size. Clearly, what's needed is a risk assessment, and information sharing is central to that. Being able to map out the patient journey and anticipate needs helps us provide the best care. So, for a routine admission, nurses should know how the patient's going to arrive, where they're going to sit, etc., and not be suddenly confronted by someone whose needs can't be met.
And what about the human dimension?
Well, a key part of optimizing care for these patients is avoiding assumptions about their capabilities. Nurses should have conversations with patients, ask how they normally handle specific tasks at home, and see if this can be adapted into the healthcare setting. As one patient put it, we know we're large. We might be living under some delusion about the extent of it or the damage that it may do to our long-term health, but we're not unaware. So although the subject needs to be handled with sensitivity, tact and dignity, it's relevant to care that it happens. And another important thing to remember is that the patient may feel worried on your behalf and be keen to work with you to reduce any risk.